I am Aida Alymbaeva, and I'm an anthropologist, and I write on issues of ethnic minorities and nationalisms and on expressions of identities through food. And today we are happy to discuss a new book of Diana Kudaibergenova, Towards Nationalizing Regimes, that was published by the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2020. And Diana Kudaibergenova is a cultural and political sociologist, and her main research interest concerns social theory of power. Diana is an author of a number of publications on post-Soviet ideologies and nationalisms. Her first book was published in 2017, and it was focused on the ways how national ideas and narratives were produced and contested in Kazakh literature. And Diana now is a lecturer in political sociology at the University of Cambridge since March 2021. And we are honored to have today two discussants for Diana's book. I am happy to introduce Sabina Insebayeva, and she is an assistant professor of Central Asian Studies at the University of Tsukuba and a research associate of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Sabina's research interests focus on the intersection of international relations, security and development cooperation of and about Central and East Asia. And Sabina has published a number of articles on identity politics, power relations, and security from the perspectives of social theory and historical sociology. And our second discussant is Berikbol Dukeyev. And Berikbol is a PhD candidate in political science and international relations at the Australian National University. His PhD thesis focuses on the politics of memory and history production in the nation building of Kazakhstan. And Berikbol's research interests include the intersection of power, history, and society in Eurasia. And the format of this event is the following. At first, we give the floor to the discussants, and then Diana will have a chance to react to the addressed questions and comments. And then we will have a Q&A session. While we have only 1 hour for the whole event, you are very welcome to write your questions from now on in the chat, that I will be able to collect questions for the discussion, for the general discussion. So now I give the floor to Sabina Insebayeva. Please.
Thank you very much, Aida. And first of all, congratulations to Diana, and thank you very much for the invitation. I should say that I very much enjoyed reading the book, and it is a wonderful one. And personally, I found it well-researched, pointed, and it is beautifully written in a relatively relaxed conversational tone. So I really like that about the book. And the amount of data presented is like large, and you can really dig down into a lot of it. And that was obviously hard to do, to collect and analyze all this information and interviews and statistical data. And I think that Diana did a really nice job at it. But after all, this is Diana, so it's really what one who knows her work comes to expect from her. And that's why I always look forward to reading what she is reading. So I encourage the audience to get the book and read it. And I'm sure people who are working in the field, in our field, will like reading this book. So personally, I learned a tremendous amount from it, in particular about the Latvian case. And not only did I myself find agreeing on many points that were raised by Diana, but even when I disagree with her, in many cases, I was persuaded by the end of the book. So speaking of my takeaways, my first takeaway from the book is the concept of nationalizing regimes, which exposes and analyzes nation building through the internal networks and interests of those who govern, namely the elites, as Diana put it, in comparison to those who ruled by them. And Diana has vividly demonstrates the diversity of competing, coexisting, and parallel discourses of nations to whom these nations belong and who has the right and power to shape and control these discourses. Another takeaway that I got from the book, and it actually runs throughout the chapters of the book, as the power of compartmentalized ideology and quasi-ideological tool created by the regime to control multiple sets of discourses addressed to varying ethnolingual audience, as Diana argued. However, I do have some questions with regard to this nationalizing regime approach. So as Diana herself put it, she centers her argument on the understanding that nationalizing processes must be understood from the perspective of elites and the structures that guide their decisions, their interests, competition, personal beliefs, values, and mindset. But Diana also mentioned numerous initiatives and decisions which provoke strong reaction from the general population. Therefore, my first question is, Diana, don't you think that the official discourse needs at least partially reflect the identity demands of the population to sustain its legitimacy? And another question that crossed my mind was regarding the doctrine of national unity, which, as you wrote, eventually failed. So should we really consider this as an official attempt to build and strengthen the civic identity in the country, or should we be more skeptical about this political decision? So at the end of the day, Kazakhstan had important strategic goals to pursue at the time, and the country's decision to adopt a number of documents before, for instance, the OSCE chairmanship in 2010 is hardly a coincidence. And also, when we talk about national identity narratives, we usually speak of civic and ethnic identity for the purpose of simplicity, of course, and it is also understandable from the points of statistics. But I'm curious to hear how you feel about historically excluded identities of underrepresented Kazakh-speaking ethnic minorities. I do know that you briefly touch upon Central Asians like Uzbeks and Uyghurs, but I'm wondering why in general you decide to omit them from your analysis, because we can observe that regime is actually capitalized on the image of this Kazakh-speaking non-Kazakhs. So we see them on TV, we see them in the parliament. So I want you to elaborate on that a bit more. And finally, we know that when prevailing ideas stop working, like, for example, the triangle of stability, prosperity, and power, as you put it, which you talked a lot about in your book, and when there is something wrong going on in the country, and we can see that it becomes more difficult to sustain the existing hegemonic discourse. And when leaders aren't listening to people on different issues, this is when we can expect to see the rise in populism, as we see in the world today, and especially in the neighboring countries like Kyrgyzstan. So how do you think how events will unfold in the nearest future in Kazakhstan in this regard? And I also want to talk a little bit about the conceptual difference between populism and nationalism, because if we try to distinguish populism and nationalism as different ways of discursively construction of the nation, then nationalism is about imagined communities, as you wrote, that is constructed through in-out or member-non-member distinction, as we saw in the Latvian case. But populism, on the other hand, revolves around down-up antagonism, in which people are just discursively constructed in a position to small, illegitimate, powerful elite group. And we can arguably say that this reminds us of certain activities we observe in modern Kazakhstan. So I would like to hear your opinion on that, and I will stop it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sabina. You were very, very timely, even 9 minutes only. Yeah, and that's a very strong discussion. Thank you. And now we give a floor to Berikbol. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aida, and thank you, Sabina, for such a brilliant analysis of the book. And I also would like to congratulate Diana with such a fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading it. So I read it twice. So it's well written, concise, that combines both qualitative and qualitative research. And I was amazed how you did about 200 interviews in both countries, also in a country that's not familiar with you as Latvia. And definitely, I believe this book would be an excellent contribution, not only for studying the Eurasian region, but I believe it would be interesting to see the applicability of this book to other regions in comparing democracies and non-democracies, also doing cross-regional studies. So from that perspective, I believe that book would be definitely can be applicable to other regions. Since the Sabina focused on the overarching argument of the book, I'd like to focus on some specific chapters of the book, particularly on the chapter about how the masses or population respond and influence to the nationalizing regimes and nation-building policies in Latvia and Kazakhstan. As you define in the book, there are two responses. One is skeptical, another one is stable. So in Latvia, it's a skeptical citizenry where because of a sacred Latvian discourse and Latvian Russian divide by the nationalizing regime. So there is a depolitization of the population, which means the low political participation. Since Latvians have a choice, both Russian-speaking and Latvian-speaking and ethnic Latvians in Latvia, so they vote with the suitcases by leaving the country because they look for better economic opportunities in European Union countries. So when it comes to the Kazakhstan, where it was a stable citizenry, so where the non-democratic regime compartmentalized, as Sabina mentioned, Kazakh-speaking and the Russian-speaking audiences, but they target these multiple audiences, both Kazakh-speaking and Russian-speaking, through offering the economic development for both of them. So then in the case of Kazakhstan, why it's stabilized citizenry, because so they are enjoying or benefiting this so-called economic development. And at the same time, there is gradual depolitization happening. So following on these responses of the masses, I'm thinking and assuming about the implications of this. So whether it means that nationalizing regime could not control the outcome of the nation building, because for me, it seems to me that what constructed by the power elites is circled around the power elites, and what was constructed by while the population or the masses, they are surrounded with their everyday matters about the economic development or anything else. Given this, I was wondering to what extent whether the power elites or the current power elites or the forthcoming power elites, how they are responding to this. Because whether the Latvian political elites, do you think that they'll integrate these socio-economic issues to their political agenda? At the same time, what about in Kazakhstan, whether Kazakhstan will interplay with nationalism, given the turning point of the Crimean annexation. And at the same time, we see that in Kazakhstan, there are many people are not happy with their economic status. Many people are leaving the country, and that's why do they need to also, and there are increasing amount of inequality, economic inequality in Kazakhstan. Given this, do the regime will try to, given this, do the nationalizing regime will try to integrate both of this? So following of these implications, so my main question is, you come at the end of the book, you come to the conclusion that nationalizing regime in Latvia are more stable than in Kazakhstan. But to what extent these discourses that was supported by this and promoted by these nationalizing regimes, to what extent they are durable in the long run? Because they have to accumulate or respond to these both groups. At the same time, following this, I'm wondering about the broader implications of the book in regards to the nationalism and democracy. So can we assume that emerging democracies, at least, will be more interested in nationalism rather than non-democracies, like non-democracies or hybrid regimes, as you mentioned, that they're less interested in democracies. And how we can, it would be applicable to the broader region beyond the post-Soviet or beyond the Eurasia? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Berikbol, for your discussion. And now we have floor for Diana to reply to the two discussions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Aida, for your chairing. Thank you, Erika, and the whole group for organizing. Thank you, Sabina, for staying up so late. We know it's quite late in Japan. Thank you so much. Thank you, Berikbol and Sabina, both for your super insightful comments and questions. I'm really, really appreciating the close reading, and I apologize if you had to read it twice. Yeah, I'm very, very excited to engage with these questions. And I think, yeah, if to go back to Sabina's point, I think, of course, the nationalizing regime is in many ways reflecting the demands of the population. And that's, I think, something whenever somebody was reading my book or my draft before it was published, is that it really struck many people that in democracies, it doesn't that matter so much to the regime of what people expect and want. And they're building their legitimacy literally, like, on other things rather than demands. I mean, they do talk about the demands of governance and so on, but they definitely do not approach the demands of the minorities in Latvia, for example, and that stays very stable. But then, and that's what was the paradox for a lot of people, is that Kazakhstan is a lot more, or Kazakh regime is a lot more open to these demands, particularly because it builds its legitimacy around this idea of satisfying the population. Doesn't matter which ethnic group it comes from. And I think Kazakh regime is sort of seeing its own people mainly through this sort of like spatial perspective, but also through class, rather than in Latvia, they do see the population through mostly ethnicity and citizenship, which is interconnected and combined. So in that way, I do agree. And I don't know how much of this is really represented in the book, but I think that's what the reviewers were also saying, is that, that's what was surprising in the Kazakh case, that the regime, if we can say, it's a legitimacy, but it definitely builds legitimacy there. In terms of the doctrine of national unity, and that's actually how my project started. I was actually initially wanted to do my PhD on the Basque nationalism, but then I was in Almaty and doctrine of national unity emerged, and I started covering it, and I was looking into different opinions, and I was reading a lot about it, and I just decided, well, okay, Basque country is away, but this is home, and I can do fieldwork on what's at home. And that's basically what led me to the interest. I mean, I always wanted to do nationalism and sociology of power, but that's what brought me back to Central Asia to do it there. And I think I do agree that civic and ethnic is something I think that is mainly used in our region. I think post-Soviet, and that's kind of like almost like a coloniality of knowledge in a way, something that is no longer useful or used in the Western hemisphere. It's kind of like, you know, recycled in this space called post-Soviet space. In a way, sort of something that is considered sort of simplistic or useful. I don't think it's useful at all. I'm a very open opponent of the civic ethnic divide. I don't believe nationalism can be civic, because nationalism is always about divisions, and thus and civicness to me is something and in ideal terms, and again of course there are no ideal terms, but at least it's supposed to strive to be that. It's about inclusivity. And also I believe that civicness should come from the society rather than top down. And in that sense, I don't think civicness can be, there are 2 points which I disagree completely conceptually with those people who do argue for civic nationalism. And one, I don't think nationalism can be civic, and I said that already. And I think if there is an idea of civicness, it's something else. It can be conceptualized in civil society, it can be conceptualized in sort of civic engagement, social movements, things like that. If you want to, if you know, you can play with that in these spheres. And second of all, I don't think it's something that can come down, top down, especially not in our societies where it's sort of like, you know, mostly non-democratic perspective. And that's why I really liked what was used in Latvia. They never used the civic approach, but they said political nation. And they conceptualized it within that frame of, you know, belonging and being part of the decision making on the political level, which is again connected to democracy. So in that sense, and I'm writing a paper about it where I'm basically criticizing the whole dichotomy, because I think, and from the literature that I'm engaging with in sort of Western or Anglo-Saxon literature, civic nationalism divide has, you know, stopped being relevant in the 1990s. So I think we should also, you know, create our own concepts, or at least give up these ones. And definitely, I don't think doctrine was, of course, it was an attempt of the regime to sort of mask and do this, like, you know, plastering and sort of create this kind of vision that something like that is happening, but definitely would have never led to the aims that it was, you know, trying to achieve, sort of uniting the population. Because in itself, if you read the text, and I read it many times, and I read the original one, and then I read the one that was amended, it was really empty of meaning. They were prescribing different categories that would never stick to people. And that's what I was doing initially research, even before starting my degree, is that, you know, people were saying, like, well, you know, we're not gonna abide by that. We're not gonna give up, you know, our ethnicity to be like for this empty connotator that doesn't have any meaning. And another thing, I guess my third problem with civic ethnic narrative, or this category, which I also criticize and sort of don't accept, is that neither ethnicity nor national belonging is something that can be fixed on the society level. So of course, when we theorize specifically, like, you know, we can theorize nation building, because, and that's why for me it was such a useful term to locate it within the regime and decision making, because nation building is about legislature, it's about certain institutions, and it's about, like, you know, documents, procedures, and practices that can be traceable, and we can trace the decision making, and we can see who are the people influencing that decision making by the virtue of having the power and being part of the power field. So thinking very sociologically or socio-theoretically, conceptually, I can encapsulate and I can analyze it within a specific frame that is working and that is not constantly fluctuating. Whereas identity, I think, and especially when we're talking about such important identity as ethnic or civic, we cannot prescribe it. It's something that exists beyond institutions. It's a lot more important and powerful because it's a lived experience, and it's about the practice that people create and recreate contextually on an everyday basis through their interactions with each other. And that's where I'm more of a proponent of what, for example, Aida Alymbaeva is doing as a social anthropologist, is that if we want to study ethnicity, we need to do it ethnographically and anthropologically through these everyday practices. Or if you cannot do everyday practices, then at least try to study the meaning from the bottom up, and you will see that it's always contextual. You can't really, you know, of course, people might have their ethnicities, but the way they're playing out with these ethnicities, especially in Central Asia, is very different. And that's where history has to play a role, because ethnicity for us was always a fluctuating sort of attribute, and it was only institutionalized or codified in the 20th century, and we have to pay attention to that. And there are all sorts of things that I would love to bring, like, you know, the ethnic, the study literature on ethnicity to that, to sort of continuously conceptualize it and through interdisciplinary lenses, both sociologically and anthropologically, that it's simply not a fixed variable. It's not the position of political scientists or statisticians to say, okay, 100 people said they are Kazakhstani and that means that it's set in stone. No, it's not. Or 100 people said they are Korean or Chechen and so on, and that's set in stone. We all know that's not how it works. So that for me, like, 3 points on which I'm completely critical of the civic ethnic divide, because none of them are as stable as we want them to be in this ideal types or when we analyze them. So it's completely unfruitful and unproductive to analyze it in that way, I believe. And I will try to finish that paper to prove my point further. And I think we need to give people more agency and pay them more tribute to the fact of how they practice their ethnic identities, how they practice their identity period. Because identity, again, going back to Brubaker, with whom I'm constantly in debate, but I do agree with him on the point of identity, is that it's not something that is fixed and we need to access it critically. Okay, I'm spending too much time on that. What happens when the certain ideas, hegemonic ideas, don't prevail? And I do see that. I still think that stability is one of the biggest values, not only in Kazakhstan, but in general in authoritarian states, because that's how the matrix of power is built across that, and especially in value system, and that's how authoritarianism achieved their legitimacy, sort of like support. I wouldn't call it legitimacy, but definitely support on the popular level. And that's very important because they are influencing the specific value system that then sort of are embedded and practiced within the society. I'm saying that a little bit from the positivist perspective, but I do have the data that prove that in this specific case. And again, that's something that will come up in the future. I love your conceptualization, sort of intriguing idea of populism and how it can develop in Kazakhstan in the future. And Sabina, I think it's fascinating. But again, as a case, it will be something that we will see in the future, obviously, and we need to analyze it. And my co-author, Asiel Tutumlu, is here, and that's particularly what we're doing right now. But I think it's in general, it's a global trend, as you correctly put it. And I think it deals with the crisis of democracy in general. And that's how we need to look at populism. That it's also, and here I'll be also a little bit, people can call me Marxist, but I'm not. But basically, it's also the crisis of democracy and global capitalist system that brings to this grievances, inequalities, and the rise of populism. But again, it's such a complex issue that it requires its own conference. And all I'm saying is that we're working on it. I think there is an alarming trend in that. I think the particular alarming trend is among the people who feel inequality the most, and these are Kazakh-speaking populations. And that's interesting to develop further. And what are the things, what are the issues they are particularly following populist agenda on, which is the idea of land reform, the idea of power sharing, the idea of representation that then is encapsulated in this populist understanding of nationalism or ethno-nationalism, which is sad to see. I'm going quickly to Berikbol's points. Thank you so much for analyzing that last chapter in so much detail. I do have faith in it. I definitely had when I was writing it, but now I'm, of course, rethinking quite a bit because my next book is talking about all the popular responses and how communities respond to powerful paradigms. So I'm rethinking quite a lot, and I think it's fruitful to hear from you. Thank you so much. But I think reflecting back on your point, I think it's very interesting how actually it is the crisis of democracy that in Latvia the elite competition is constructed in such a way that despite of all the grievances from the society, despite of the lack, decreasing level of political participation through the open and contested, through elections where they can vote, actually, because it is a democracy. The elites do not, the ruling elites do not move away from the consensus that they have established in the 90s, is that they don't want to allow non-Latvians to the power field. They don't want to allow any ethnic Russian or Slavophone person, whoever is not Latvian, to basically form a government, to form cabinet, even to become a minister. So I think that's a very key issue, is that how do we deal with that pre-political consensus? How can we study in democracies, even though elites are changing? And that was a big puzzle for me. Elites are changing over periods of time. Nobody stays in power for more than 7 years, but the discourse is constantly there, and that discourse is influencing their competition, which I think is fascinating, despite all the things that are coming from the society. And I think I did talk about the tragedy in Zolitude when the supermarket roof collapsed and a lot of people died, and the prime minister had to resign, but it didn't lead, it led to the crisis within the ruling party, but it did not lead to lasting effects of how the power field was changing their rules of the game. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. It's basically, and that's where nationalizing regime is so important as a framework, is that it shows that certain things are valued by the elites a lot more, and their ability to remain in power, and their ability to sustain the consensus, I mean, status quo on the idea of the Latvian ruling coalition, no matter which politicians come, might be far right, might be, you know, they're not anymore, they're not a single centrist party in the ruling bloc anymore, but it has to be within this framework of the Latvian sacred nation, and not, you know, that consensus cannot change. So I think that's very, very sort of showing how the regime itself is very stagnant in a way, because it's constantly imagining the competition coming from within, and framing it in such terms that, again, are constantly changing, and Russians themselves are quite, you know, I mean, the non-Latvian population is also changing their identities, and regime is simply not responding to that at all. Whereas in Kazakhstan, we can see that there's a lot more leverage on that, and regime is a lot more flexible in certain ways, of course, not in a major way, but nevertheless, they want to meet those demands. And I think this kind of sort of logics or the rules of the game, right, and going back to Bourdieu, are very interesting and important to discuss and continue to discuss, both in terms of non-democracies and how it works out in democracy. But yeah, I don't want to be quite, you know, negative or pessimistic on that side, but I think we're living through, and I'm not the first one or the only one to say that, but I think we're living through the major crisis of democracy as a system. But on the other hand, we're also living through a major crisis of dictatorships. And we as social scientists just basically need to be very attentive to these things, and we need to, you know, continuously write as much of rich data as we can, because I think a lot of, that's my last point, I think a lot of our discussions in general, again, through the coloniality of knowledge, is about creating universal knowledge, right? So it's about creating universal frameworks that can work elsewhere and so on. But in that, we're always engaging and trying to chase that idea. We're constantly forgetting about how important it is to engage with something small, but to contextualize it so richly that, I don't like the word case study, but it becomes kind of like an exemplary that can be used then elsewhere. But you need to be an expert. You need to be so detailed and know your field so well, for example, Kazakhstan or Central Asia, that then somebody else, if you describe it in such a richness, somebody else can use it in another case. And I'm definitely sure that nationalizing regimes can be used in Britain. They can be used as a framework in the United States during Trump. It can be used in Zambia or in other places, definitely. But that's, I think, for me as a scholar, is also very important. I'm battling my own battles every day about that. But I think it's important to sustain that richness so that then it can be exemplified in another case, because those are the books I love myself the most. Lisa Widin on Middle East, Hazem Kandil on the Middle East as well. They're so rich in the historical contemporary context and describing all of these different logics that then I can take it, and even though it might be on Egypt or Syria, but I can take it and I know it so well, and I can, you know, transfer that case somewhere else and create theory based on that intervention and on that sort of dialogue between cases. So that's my last point. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Thank you, Diana. As usually, very, very rich and great. So thank you for the discussion. We are opening the floor, and we have the first question from Erika. Can you actually call authoritarian regimes as well as their policies stable if the state apparatus hinges on one person? And when that person is gone, where may not be a stable coalition?
Yeah, I think that's a very challenging question, Erika. I think yes, and I kind of, in the book, I'm talking about how Nazarbayev regime, for example, is a very personalized nationalizing regime, where a lot of the discourses, if not all of them, are based on this idea that there's one person and he's the guarantor of all the peace and stability and development and prosperity in the country. And if he goes, that's it. And we, for a very long time, I'm a citizen of Kazakhstan, we for a very long time believed in that idea, right? And we lived within that. I didn't live in that fear, but definitely there were studies about what's going to happen and the successor plan A, successor plan B. There were a lot of conspiracy theories as well, not so long ago. President Nazarbayev resigned 2 years ago only, but basically that discussion started almost in 2000s, and we lived with that for 20 years. But when and he's not completely departed yet, but I think we need to change our perspective on the ways we study authoritarianisms and dictatorships. I really like the word dictatorship because it really, showed that perspective that there's no political challenger to the power, but at least through democratic or election process. The way we need to understand dictatorships, and I think, again, many of my colleagues who are here will be on board with me, is that we need to study it through regimes rather than personalities. Of course, personalities at the top, and that's what we see, that's the tip of the iceberg. But I think the system within is built through different, and it's both the logic of institutions and it's the logic of the regime. You can't take just one or the other. I think it's like, amalgamated. And I use that again. I'm borrowing from my teacher, Dr. Kantil. He writes on Middle East, Egypt, Iran, and Turkey, and he talks in conclusion. He basically talks that the state and regime under authoritarianism become amalgamated, and that's the idea I'm really trying to battle through right now. Because the state is the state, but then nevertheless we see the state as also a very powerful figure simply because regime occupies it and becomes one with it. But I think the power of the specific dictatorship is not within one person. It's within the system. And of course, one person can be or may not be the guarantor, sort of stability, watchdog, as I call Nazarbayev in one of my papers. But then nevertheless, it's not always like that. And there are different types of regimes. I think Milan Svolik writes very interestingly about it, right? About the consensus in dictatorships. And I agree with him that I don't think it's one singular power. And I think there's a lot of interesting literature emerging on authoritarianism right now, where they talk about the interplay of different institutions or different parts of the regime that all have to be in consensus in order for the regime to be stable. And it's not always about just one president or one leader. It can be a military coalition, security coalition. Again, I'm talking a lot about Kandil's work. It can be like political coalition all together, and that's what he calls power triangle. Or it can be formal institutions like Jennifer Gandhi talks about, right? It can be legislative institutions with the regime. But I think in our cases, we don't have military, obviously, that's not as strong, but we have the systematic approach of different elites, different institutions playing out within the regime. And it's not always just one president, I think. Sorry for taking so long to answer.
Thank you, Diana. We have two questions, one from Svetlana and one from Rano. If the conceptualizations of family and feminism plays, Svetlana, is it feminism or feminism?
Feminism.
Okay, plays a role in the nationalizing regimes you were studying? And if yes, how, what ways? And from Rano is about the questions that students of Rano raised. They were confused.
The regime was not clear, okay.
Yeah. So the students were confused with not clearly defined term of the term regime. And here I let myself to squeeze a bit with my comments and small questions. So additionally to all other the great reviews of the book, I think that this book is fascinating in its approach of looking at the nation building, not only as a process, but also as a space, an instrument, language, and a source by itself for and of decision-making mechanisms used by the actors in power. And among the other important aspects that already were addressed here, I found the book's point to the difference between the cult regime and personalized nationalizing regime is a very important contribution to the Central Asian studies. And the destiny of Karimov's regime in Uzbekistan seems to be a kind of hybrid case, as it seems that diminishing of Karimov's legacy is taking place, but slowly. Although comparison of Nazarbayev's portrait's popularity with Lenin's cult gives a little pinch of concern on how Nazarbayev's legacy will develop further in Kazakhstan. I also find very interesting the fact that the artistic activism forms of protest, or at least attempts to protest against Nazarbayev's regime. I wonder how this artistic activism perceived by ordinary people in Kazakhstan, and whether is there a kind of successful example when one regime was thrown by such an artistic way of protest in any political context on the globe. And also, I find the term regime is usually used with the words totalitarian or authoritarian, but the term state is usually used with the word democratic in the discourses. I wonder why is it? And last is that the term nationalizing is implied to the so-called new states of post-Soviet context. I would guess that the framework of nationalizing regimes would also be well implied to other post-colonial contexts. How would you apply it to study Britain politics, for instance? And yeah, now we have 18 minutes. Probably you just pick up questions.
Thank you so much, Aida. Your questions are absolutely fascinating. I'm going to try to come to them. But just briefly to Svetlana, yes, family and familism. I didn't find it when I was studying Kazakhstan and Latvia. I know they are there, definitely. I use more concept of communities, but I am using family and familism in my well, I don't know when that studies will come out, but basically, yes, I encountered it in my other fieldwork. And I think it's a very, very important concept when it comes to the more and more consolidated authoritarian regime. There's a consolidated regime, but then there's like, doubly consolidated. And I think that's where it works very importantly. But I love that point. And I think definitely, and it has to be, I'm gonna be challenging all sorts of perspective on family as a unit, as a traditionalist unit, in culture, embedded in culture, local culture, and so on. So I'm in the beginning there, but I'm having my notes, and I'm very interested in that concept. Thank you so much for bringing it up. But not I don't use it in this book because I was focusing more on sort of regime and elites perspective. To Rano, I don't know where your students look for it, but I definitely dedicated so much pages of the introduction to giving that perspective, and the whole book is discussing regimes. But on page 8, I do actually have the definition at the last paragraph, and regime is derived from the comparative politics, where it's referring to as the formal and informal structure, and I'm quoting, and nature of political power in the country, including the method of determining office holders and the relations between the office holders and the society at large. And that goes back a little bit, end of quote, that goes back a little bit to the concept, to the question of Aida, of why regimes are considered as totalitarian, authoritarian, and states are not. Well, states in general in democratic conditions, because probably of the idea of governance and government, that's a quick answer. But regimes, and that's what people also were telling me, that it's, it's considered something negative, and how can you use regime in Latvia? I'm actually, from the definition, you can see that it's nothing, I mean, there's nothing bad about regime. Regimes is simply, to me, regimes are the rules of the game. Okay, and none of the political system, none of the political community can live without the rules of the game. And that, to me, in that particular definition, to me, was very clear and key. Who determines to hold the office or the political decision making in this community, and what are the relationships between those who govern and those who are ruled, as Sabina said it, right? So technically, and the easiest way to describe it is basically the rules of the game. And that's, again, the definition of the field by Pierre Bourdieu that I was also using and was quite influenced by in this particular study. So I don't think it's something that should be taken negatively. And maybe in many ways, my aim was to bring the regimes back in, right? The Scotch had the book Bringing the States Back in. My aim was to bring the regimes back in and sort of like, conceptualizing how we study particular, again, rules of the game within the political community. So to me, that doesn't have a negative connotation. Of course, I think in many ways, the idea of the Cold War and so on, I'm revisiting a lot of literature from that period right now, so I'm not gonna criticize it too much before revisiting it again. But I do believe that regimes as a concept is a very useful term in general if you study decision making, and that was my aim in this book, political decision making from the top. And I found this framework very useful, and I'm still working with it. I do like regimes, and I'm gonna take it further. Although in authoritarian or dictatorial context, but I'd love to take that lens and see how it works in the idea of governance, for example, right? And I'm very, very interested in that. So I don't think it's something that we need to take negatively. It's actually very productive and useful term to me. Thank you so much for bringing out the artistic activism. That's what my next book is all about. Although of course, I mean, artistic communities, and I'm not saying that artistic communities should or should not form into political parties, be formally institutionalized or form into social movements and claim power or anything like that. They can, but it's definitely not something like a blueprint that they should do. And I'm always saying that the artistic field, especially in Central Asia, is super complex. It doesn't follow one specific logic. It's in constant conflict with each other, super pluralistic, but that what gives it its power, that it has, because it's pluralistic and because it's not dependent on each other and it's not dependent on the state for the sponsorship, for censorship, for anything like that. And that's its power, because it's able to produce alternative meaning making beyond the frameworks and beyond the power prescribed by the state, which was the case of the Soviet Union, when, as we know, all artistic production was within the realm of political propaganda of the state. And social realism was precisely that. Whether it was good or bad, I'm not going to give the judgment points on that, but it's the fact that Soviet socialist realist art was the only art that was possible to do, apart from the dissidents that then emerged in the later periods, and it was the tool of propaganda. Whether there are any cases of artists overthrowing regimes in other places, I think what's important, again, and that's why I'm saying that art should not be expected to formalize and to claim particular or intervene in political situation through formal institutionalization like parties or social movements or anything like that, or like revolutions, which is not formal, but nevertheless seen as sort of like, the shift. I think what art is important is precisely in creating that space of pluralism. It's important in creating the sense to question and to be critical of the status quo of what's going on. Is to question the categories of power, is to question the status quo, is to question who has the power, what is the power, and so on and so forth. And that's where art is important. Two cases that I can think of that I was recently reading on is obviously Pinochet Chile, and I absolutely love. Of course, we cannot say that art there overthrew them, but it gave the space for rethinking that there is a possibility for something else. And definitely what continues on right now with activism and ongoing sort of like feminist movements and so on in Latin America is part of that to me, and that understanding. And another case is, of course, for example, I was reading Václav Havel the other day, and he's letter of the intellectual. That's also
for me, that's part of the success story of how art can at least become part of the process of then living through post-totalitarianism and providing the alternative way to that previous regime. How nationalizing regimes can be used in Britain, for example, absolutely. If you take it as a framework beyond, and I guess, and I should do something about it, and I should write beyond post-Soviet space so that it doesn't we don't always think that if nationalism happens, it's only in the post-Soviet space. And actually, when I was writing the book, I was writing it in intervention to Rogers Brubaker, who does kind of frame it in such a way that nationalism only happens in sort of Eastern Europe and that post-communist space of former Soviet Union. I don't think it's the case, and I think what happened, and I do cite it in the introduction, is what happened with Brexit is definitely something that can be framed like that. It was, and if you want to use the mechanism or conceptualization of nationalizing regimes, specifically with the decision making of the elites, with their coalitions, with their discourse production, how they frame their decision through this specific dominant discourse, you can actually, I think, analyze any state, be it Britain or be it, as you said, any post-colonial state. I think in post-colonial, again, in any case, it would require a bit more contextualization, and that's where empirical richness is so important, right? That you need to build the context and explain it more within its own context. But I think as a framework, it definitely works. And I do read a lot of my colleagues' studies, British sociologists who are working on issues of nationalism or issues on minorities and so on and so forth in Britain. And I can see that it definitely, there are comparisons there. We didn't come from Mars or something in post-Soviet space. That, of course, our systems were not slightly, but very different. But it doesn't mean that everything that happens in our space cannot be comparable to anything that happens in the world elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes to finish, and anyone who wants, because I don't see any hands raised. Maybe Berikbol or Sabina, you would like to answer or to raise or something, if no one else wants from the audience. So then I would throw one last question. So the term nationalizing, thanks to Brubaker, is really becomes pinned or point or I don't know, to the post-Soviet space. And now when we hear nationalizing before your book, it was really about that some new state that tries to define their national identity or their nation building process and something. And as you just now clarified once again that it's not only about the new states, it's about any state, because any state is always within ongoing process of nation building process, because it's I think any process in a society is never ending. Yeah. And my question was that if nationalizing is a kind of synonym to nation building process as a way somewhere with kind of clear-cut idea of nation or clear-cut nation, is it ever possible? And it's a rhetoric question. Yeah.
No, I think, and poor Rogers Brubaker, you know, he wrote so many things about other cases as well. It just by the virtue of what happened by the turn of history, you know, I think, yeah, his nationalizing states became kind of like the one thing that but though to me he's not known just because of that. I'm actually, you know, upset because he, as I said, he has fantastic work on all sorts of things, like recently on race, and he wrote about, like, you know, this racial perspective where he has a piece of religion. He wrote on a number of different things in that perspective. But definitely it's partially our fault as well, so of post-Soviet scholars, that for a very long time this term was taken uncritically and people were just overusing it, right? And that goes bigger to the debate of how we construct these dominant frameworks and how we give them power, because a lot of things are published, but then certain things get cited and they become the sort of like final truth. When I started my PhD, his revisited nationalizing states paper came out, and I just, like, you know, I was like, I'm not convinced. I'm gonna, you know, I don't think it's a state, it's something else. And because of that question, because of that puzzle, that's what it led to, right? Is that we have to be critical of things. But the idea of nationalizing is that it's not set in stone. And I think for a very long time, certain people did think that, okay, once we're going to build the nation, this is it, that, you know, nothing is going to change. But that's what I like about this term, is that nationalizing talks about the constant process, that we never finished. The nation is never finished as a project. Our belonging, our consciousness, our identity, our national consciousness, our identity, and our even ethnicity, all the frameworks and categories we exist with, containing not only, well, mainly nation, if we're talking about nationalizing here, are not, you know, they never ending, basically. And we constantly, and even though people might say, this is it, I'm Kazakh or I'm Latvian, and there's nothing else that's going to change, but then something happens. I don't know, like that's what would happen, for example, in Kazakhstan, right? Somebody comes out half naked in a national costume when it's a girl, and that throws your national identity into question, that throws your values in question. How can you say that then it's set in stone if there's, like, you know, one small thing on Instagram can throw your whole perspective into question and create a conflict? Because essentially it does create a question, and it makes you question your perspective and makes you defend it. The whole idea around Uyat, right? The big concept both in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan that is used particularly in patriarchal nationalist frames is also about that. It's about the insecurity, and it's about the constant process of trying to defend your national, because you feel like it's not a finished project. It needs defending. It needs defending on the meaning making level. You need to, I don't know, suppress poor women for the expression of whatever. It's their right to do so, but you need to suppress them in order to defend your nation. And if you weren't so sure that, you know, the national project is finished, finished and that's it, it's set in stone, it's stable, you wouldn't have reacted so much to the, you know, to the smallest thing, as I said, that appears online, that appears in all these frameworks and so on. So I think that's what I love about the nationalizing. I think why you constantly think that it's post-Soviet, it's because we are encapsulated in that sense within our space, which is also fine by me, but because I read quite a lot of literature on other cases, and I can see that it's the same elsewhere. It's not like there is one state or one place in the world that has, you know, found the final truth and they know who they are and nothing is changing. Okay, it's not like that. Citizenship laws do get changed. There are amendments to how you feel. There are amendments to I don't know, discourses that are constructed and so on and so forth. So it's never ending. And nationalizing is going around everywhere. Argentina, United States, this country, United Kingdom, Kazakhstan, Russia. You put a finger on the map and it's going to be nationalizing there. Nothing is set in stone anywhere in the world. If I have last 3 minutes, I just wanted to say that, and I don't never get a chance to say it in book discussions, is that the cover of the book is provided by a fantastic artist from Kazakhstan, Ashat Akhmedyarov. It was really hard for me to find the book cover connecting both Latvia and Kazakhstan, but I think his performance, If the Pain Could Burn Away, he was staged at the Karlag camp, concentration camp near Astana, is very, very telling, and it talks about, you know, this sort of overcoming the post-Sovietness, and that's, I think, what we all need to do at some point. We need to overcome the post-Soviet in us, within us as well. So, thank you so much for your engaging comments. Thank you so much for bringing the, you know, discussion and dialogue for that. I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Sabina and Berikbol, and thank you everyone who came and joined us today. So I wish everyone very successful time being further, staying healthy, and see you next time for the next book discussion here.